Hello, everyone, and welcome to Making the Rounds. We skipped a week, but you probably care more about what Emily has to say than I do anyway, and you got to watch Tea of Legends, so that was really exciting. We are back with Making the Rounds. I ended up going on a really, really long rant, I remember, about how I thought that IG should win the quarterfinals, but I still didn't think that they would, for an arbitrary reason. And then IG won for many of the reasons that I said. And then they lost the semifinal because I said that they would win in my head. So that's a fun one.
I also picked IG to win. Like, it's funny because my prediction rate, if you take out Chinese teams, is like really good, and then like all three Chinese teams just bring my to the basement. Great.
It's the more you watch LPL, the less you understand it, for sure.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good place to start, is just with that semifinal series, for sure. So we're probably going to go over a very similar format for both of the series to kind of hash out what we think went wrong for the losing team, what we think that the winning team did well, and then of course like the looming draft topic, which we've been discussing really extensively pretty much all season. So
I called IG to win this series, and they did not. Because I still think, like, you know how you watch IG and you can't keep getting away with it because they have, like, that late game team fight where with FPX, it's like they can't keep getting away with it because they always do, like, the same thing. But FPX did end up winning the series. I actually didn't mind IG's draft in that I was glad that they got, like, as much as he won with it, and as much as I think it shows off his teamfight targeting and CC abilities and like positioning in teamfight, I don't like going beyond Nautilus. The last time he played Nautilus was actually against IG in a loss in the regular season. Their only, and that was another reason why going into the series I picked IGs, because I thought they know what to do. Get Doinby on a melee champion. So he doesn't have as much mid control, and it affects the way that Tion has to path. It affects like Crisp's roam, which are kind of the heart of how FPX work, with that kind of 3-man roaming death squad, whatever you want to. But that is not what happens. I think the only thing I'd point out is that I was surprised at how much gave up Kiana. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what you thought of IG's drafting. Since we're starting with drafting first, I actually thought it was a good idea to get Doinby onto the Nautilus, despite the fact that they won with it.
I kind of want to talk about the first game, because this was the draft where there was like the Twitter conversation between LS and Peter Dunn, right?
Yeah.
So this is probably the draft that most people care about discussing anyway. I think that both of them had good points, but ultimately I don't know what IG's comp is supposed to do into FPX's comp. So that was my biggest thing with it, is that, yeah, okay, if you look lane by lane, there's definitely like decent scaling options if you just look at the champion in isolation, and then like in theory you could 1-3-1. But the thing is that FPX's comp is almost always going to get mid prio, right, as a 3. And then basically, how do you push out the 1-3-1 against Kiana, Nautilus, and I don't understand that part. And then if you try to team fight, you probably lose the team fight, right? Because you're using immobile carries into Rumble Kiana. So your only option is to look for like jungle picks, basically, with Varus, Gragas, Syndra. Like, those are all good at doing that type of thing. But then you're contesting jungle vision versus Kiana. So I think that's part of...
I was going to say, then you have to risk fighting Kiana and Rumble in choke points, which is not fun.
So yeah, I could see LS's point that IG has champions that outscale in isolation, but how do they execute together? It would be my question in terms of anyone who thinks that this is a one draft. And then he boiled it down to like the Rumble Syndra matchup, and obviously, yeah, Syndra wins, but Rumble can get free prio in the first few waves, and that's all Doinby needs to dive the side lane. Which was what Peter was saying. I don't like that should have been an expected play, and I actually thought in that game IG countered it pretty well, I think, on the first round. But it just kept being a reiterated kind of loop. And eventually they got one, and it's like, you only have to get the one. You can give up a million things. If you never get the one, then you're basically fucked. But if you keep doing it and you eventually get it, then there you go. So that was kind of my issue with the entire with the entire first game draft. So I actually preferred FPX's draft in that situation. Second game.
See, I thought this is where I thought IG were gonna win, honestly,
yeah.
because
they did
I was
win
like,
the
okay,
game, right?
they get Joinby off of something that, like, they put him on a melee matchup. It reminded me a lot of their last time they met in the regular season. And this is where in the series I was like, okay, like IG should be able to take over the series from here, and that's not what happened.
Yeah, I mean, this game, FPX got super ahead, but their comp is so low damage outside of the Kai'Sa, and they actually have a lot of ways to deal with Kai'Sa. Like, there's almost no good CC if Vladimir dodges, like, unless Nautilus is targeting Vladimir every single time. There's basically no way to completely remove, like, Mordekaiser has to remove Vladimir, but Mordekaiser shouldn't be able to get out of sight in the later stages of the game. I don't know, they had a lot of ways of dealing with the Kai'Sa, and then otherwise FPX didn't have a good composition for dealing damage, so they still almost won that game. Everyone's gonna complain about Crisp's, like, engage near the Baron Pit, but I think that even if that fight goes well for FPX, there's still a lot of ways back into the game for IG, so I wouldn't say it's on that single play. That's like saying that Misfits were one play away from beating SKT or whatever, but it's like, okay, if Misfits hadn't succeeded in that dive, then they probably still are going to lose the game. And then there were a bunch of little moments where they almost lost the game up to that also, so it's like a very similar situation.
I think the big thing about game 2 that, like, I'll reiterate because I already said it, but, like, FPX will draft this themselves, right? Like, this isn't, they're still looking at this draft and they're like, yeah, this is like what we wanted. And this is a really good way that you can exploit FPX because they will sometimes pick these, like, low damage comps with Joinby on something like a Nautilus. So it's actually a really good way to attack them because they inexplicably return to these kind of compositions despite the fact that they're not that great.
I would say, though, that their adaptation in the next games by getting more scaling damage from the top lane position, like the GP, was really strong. I think that Gimgoon doesn't play a lot of damage carries, so this is something that they could have targeted for in draft, but instead they became super paranoid of stuff like Rek'Sai, Lee Sin. It's like, alright, I don't know if banning for jungle matchup is gonna help Ning all that much. I'm just gonna throw that out there. Especially when you're leaving Gragas open anyway, which I feel like is a really, really kind of iconic champion for TN. And it's also really, really good in conjunction with, like, the Varus Tahm Kench, because of the extra safety, and it allows you to actually contest the midsection against a lot of mid laners, where Varus is usually really vulnerable, so he can't, like, fight for mid prio. So I don't understand why you would go for, like, the Lee Sin Rek'Sai bans. Other than the fact that obviously direct 1-to-1 jungle matchup, it's good, but this is the way that IG drafts a lot, right? Is that they tunnel on these, like, direct 1-to-1 matchups instead of thinking compositionally about how FPX want to play and about how they want to play. And sometimes that's really good for them because they have really strong lanes across the board, and I just think that FPX are never going to be in a position where those matchups are going to matter because they're going to drop stuff for, like, risky plays, and unless you're reacting well to these kind of, like, high risk, high reward plays, well, it doesn't matter, right? It just doesn't. Yeah. So you have to kind of understand that you need to have good reaction to these types of play setups from FPX, and I think that IG just didn't in general. Like, I felt like they actually, in the best of 3 that they played against them in the regular season, where IG actually won, You go through that game, like I actually think Ning out jungled Tian in that series because became very clear the kind of play that they also played the Nautilus mid setup.
Yeah.
In that game, it became very clear like Tian's path was going to be go bot, go mid, go bot, go mid, and then Ning was able to completely control top side and push out Kim Goon on that side. So I think also FPX had a good adaptation if you think about that series in terms of putting a lot more resources into controlling the top side of the map.
Top side.
Matching the top side of the map. So it's just the reactions to those really early 3v3s, 4v4s. Watching NA solo queue the day after, it's like, why is the bot lane roaming mid? Oh, okay, they must have watched this.
You might not like it, but this is what peak League of Legends looks like.
So yeah, I felt like, okay, there were a lot of things to criticize about how IG were doing their drafts, but IG typically do their drafts for those types of strong lane matchups anyway. And I don't necessarily even think drafting for strong mid jungle, like counterpicking jungle, counterpicking mid, like these types of things are bad. I think that's actually a really good way to approach FPX. You just also have to be willing to match roams with the support. And this was something that I think Baoan did really well in the World Championship final last year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, against Fnatic.
But
that's actually one of the reasons why I thought Fnatic were going to win, is because Baolin, I was like, he can't match match roams.
But
and they did.
Got completely outplayed by Crisp this series. I think that was a really big factor. Like, yeah, I think Tian definitely deserved MVP here, but I think what ended up being a bigger factor was just Crisp constantly being where Batlin was not. So, in terms, what did you think was kind of the biggest factor, the main differentiating thing for FPX's victory?
I mean, I think the fact that IG seemed to have forgotten how to play against that, again, those 3-man roams that FPX really like to do. Because I thought their reaction to that was like surprisingly poor for a team that should know more than any other team at this tournament how FPX like to play. And then I also thought like a lot of the I do want to call out to some extent, like Doinby, actually, I mean, kind of everyone like played team fights surprisingly well on FPX in this series. Like, not that FPX are terrible at team fighting, but when you think of how IG have been winning this entire tournament, it's usually off of like, one insane team fight where Rookie and the Shy, or Jackie Love is going in and it actually like ends up working out, and he performs really well in a team fight or something like that. And I think we saw flashes of that, especially in the last game where Jackie Love and the Shy comboed for that like really great chase on top side, where it's like the perfect example of why you pair Kale with Kai'Sa, right? Because like Kai'Sa goes in, Kale ult comes down, like Jackie Love cleans up, and it was great. And then the next minute they don't, like, they basically execute it about as poorly as you possibly could. And I don't, and I wrote about this before the series even started, like, I don't want to say like the team with the better synergy definitely wins right now, because I think that's like boiling it down to something that's like a bit too simple. But I will say that on this day, FPX team fought as 5 a lot better than I was expecting. And that, in my opinion, was a major differentiating factor in terms of how IG had been winning up to this point and why they ended up losing in the series, is because if they did botch matching the triple room from FPX, matching support rooms, not getting mid prio at good times, like if they couldn't match that, they should have, or like theoretically they would have been able to out team fight FPX, but they couldn't for whatever reason. So That was like a major differentiating factor in this series for me, is that I actually thought IG were going to, especially with something like, for example, the Kale Galio Rakan Kaisa composition that they played in game 4. I thought I looked at that and I was like, okay, like this is gonna go 5 games. But then their execution was just really, really sloppy. And I don't know if it's because, again, like Ning is still getting used to playing with the team, or IG have never been noted for their like outstanding synergy as 5. But yeah, the team fighting from IG is something I wanted to point out because I thought it was a pretty big factor in deciding the series.
I thought it was interesting because you go from the initial drafts and you assume that, okay, IG's approach is we're going to have a stronger jungle and mid matchup, right? So this seems to be the way that they're approaching it. It's just strictly 1-for-1. We're going to have stronger matchups in these scenarios. And Rookie's going to get ahead. And I think this is also why they allowed the Kiana pick, is because Kiana can't really impact anything until level 3. She has kind of a slow clear. She's a pretty weak early game jungle, so they're like, okay, we really are going to have a bigger mid-jungle impact before Rookie's going to get ahead, and we're going to shut down doing these rooms just by having these strong lane matchups. So I thought that that was kind of it, but by the time they got to the 4th game, you see a very different draft prioritization where they went back to kind of what allowed them to win versus Griffin, which was the like better scaling team fight compositions, because these are ending up being games that are being decided later. In these sort of skirmish heavy fights, we're not able to actually shut down the mid jungle 2v2 because it's not a mid jungle 2v2. It's a mid bot 4v4. So we're not really able to kind of answer this. So we're going to go ahead and just play for these team fights and do better. And I think that they almost got the 4th game victory with that. And I thought it was going to go to game 5, but the Shy just fucking, holy fuck, man. I'm gonna face tank 5 people in the middle of a team fight, and like those should have been 1 fights. They really should have.
It was rough. It was rough to watch, especially from a player that you thought was going to, like, if anyone was going to take over the series, it was going to be him, right? Like looking at the matchups and looking at how these teams have performed during the tournament, you're like, okay, like the Shy is probably going to stomp Gamgoon top, and it's going to affect where Tiana is going to be able to path. It's going to, affect mid jungle, and yeah, his Kale game was boof.
Because I mean, talking about Gamgoon, it's like obviously he got a lot of praise after the series, and deservedly so, because in previous iterations where we've seen him, he's looked like Sword versus the Shy, except it's him versus Vizichachi. Like, it's been that bad. Yeah. It's been that disappointing to watch this guy play. And I've never been, like, a big Gamgoon fan, but he just played GP. He didn't fuck up his lane and have to back at, like, level 3 repeatedly, like he did versus Zoom. All these situations, he just played his GP. He chilled in the top lane, did his job in team fights. It was very kind of what we would say is a good Gamgoon performance. It would be an expected performance from any other like world-class top laner, but it was like a higher level Gamgoon performance right there.
Yeah.
So these are the standards.
This is honestly like one of the best series I've seen him play in his career.
And I really want to watch kind of the top lane preview for this series, because I was really surprised by how even the lane matchups were. So I'm wondering if it was Gamgoon playing really well or the Shy playing really off, because as the series went on, we saw the Shy play more off. And I actually kept thinking about the video that G2 put out, which was like Perks versus Rookie's date. And Perks was saying like last year you beat both me and Caps, right? So we want revenge. And then Rookie says, well, maybe this year I think you have to beat the Shy. And that wasn't the Shy that we expected to see. It was like, if we expected an underperformance from anyone, it was probably not him. Especially after this year, I would say that he underperformed in LPL regular season, but not to the extent that Rookie did, in my opinion, which is why I still had him in the top laners, and I still ranked him number 1 in my top 3 top laners going into Worlds. But Rookie was Rookie was really running it down. I was like, all right, it wasn't just misplays, it was just map decision making, all this stuff. And so I see the Shy doing something similar this series. It's like, all right, pack it up, boys. What is Jackie Love doing? Not stepping up to carry? Okay. I think Jackie Love had a decent series though. I don't think
Jackie Love had a good series here. I think he underperformed overall, definitely compared to my expectations going into the tournament, though, because he was so good in their qualifying run.
This wasn't LNG series Jackie Love, where where Jackie Love was like up kills and gold and really trying desperately to hold down the fort while his solo lanes were running it down. This was just like this was like World Championship semifinals 2018 Jackie Love was basically how it was, which was like a pretty good performance, like performing more than what you would say from someone has a reputation for choking, but not to the extent that he performed in regular season. So
yeah.
Okay. So that's kind of that series. Moving on to SKT versus G2, which was a very, very,
completely
different series. If there's any sort, like, you know, the kind of memey Reddit interpretation of why NA is failing, which is that they don't embrace like a unique play style. They're not embracing a unique style of League of Legends. Like, just look at these two series. I imagine they'll be brought up as examples of why that should be the case, and that's what NA should be doing. But anyway,
well, have you heard the Korean community like discussion? Because apparently there's been a lot of discussion where it's like LCK teams, they just try to find the perfect way to play, so they find whatever team is the best and try to copy them, and they don't know how to play on their own.
Yeah, I've heard
variant and stuff like that. That was like apparently one of the major discussions after the series, as people were trying to like digest it.
And I don't want to bring up NA because they have no business being discussed in the world semifinal discussion. But I think it's fair that there are similar criticisms, because I see very similar styles of coaching and like lower levels, or based on people who have experience in lower levels of LCK coaching with like lower levels of NA coaching, which is just very copycat syndrome type coaching styles. So it's potentially a fair amount of criticism, but I wouldn't say that that's the reason why these teams are significantly worse. So this one,
the series.
Let's talk about the drafts for this one, because I think there was a lot of for me, it was less clear looking at the drafts who I thought was going to do well, based on what was going on. Because I was like, oh, IG are drafting for lanes, but they're just going to team fight again, so this is going to be a loss. So for me, I think there were kind of slightly more balanced drafts on the SKT. I saw a lot of people saying they were surprised by the Renekton, but I think Renekton Elise is a very big kind of SKT staple. So I wasn't really surprised by the Renekton priority. I was surprised by some of these really weird kind of all in on Teddy comps. But I don't, like, again, for me, I felt like draft was much less the defining factor of this series. What do you think?
Yeah, it's going into this. I was actually like, I picked G2 to win for anyone who didn't watch T of Legends. But I said, I was like, I think this is the series that's going to be the most defined by draft. And it was not. I was actually IGFBX. So I was wrong about that. I think some of the things that we saw, because like I was really happy with some of the changes that SKT made at the World Championship in their draft priority, which is why, like, again, you already pointed it out, but I don't think the Renekton is like terrible, because I think it goes along with what they've been trying to do, which is have more early game pressure, especially around Glid. So if you have that super strong top side with Khan on the Renekton, it typically can work out really well for them. And I think like in a lot of their like very early games, it did work out well for them. It's just a matter of, again, going into the series as well, I was like, SKT, I'm really happy that they're trying these comps, but their execution is really lacking. And we talked about it when we talked about their games in Group C as well, right? Like, where we're like, okay, they're picking these compositions, they're different, they're trying new things, they're obviously trying to make more of the fact that they do have a very early aggressive jungler if they want him to be, right? Like Clid, that's what he's known for. You have a top laner who also wants to be pretty aggressive early. Khan is known for playing really far up in lane, and while he has fixed some of that through the years, like he's always going to be that kind of top who just really wants to start dominating his lane matchup from early levels, right? So I was happy that they were leaning into that, but at the same time, their execution, not even in this series, but going into this series, was incredibly lacking. Especially if you look at I think the Splice series is probably some of the more glaring examples of the mistakes that they made around some of these more early like dominating lane focused compositions. And also the fact that some of their players, aka Teddy on Draven, did not look super comfortable with how to execute these comps either. So I think more than draft, that's what it came down to SKT for me. It was just like really botched execution of some of these drafts. And G2 were more than happy to take advantage of that.
So what I thought was interesting here was kind of the culmination of a lot of the stuff that I had pointed out going into the tournament, between the difference between how the top level European teams were playing and how I saw the top level LCK teams were playing, which is that I felt like a lot of LCK teams were not really able to get advantages outside of neutral fights. And I think that you see SKT really, really prioritizing things like dragons, stuff like this, and drafting in that vein, and then G2 drafting to an extent around that. I also think a big thing that but I also want to highlight that I felt like there were a lot of moments where SKT kind of adapted. And some of that was, okay, Wonder didn't have a great tournament, and we have a top laner who's been performing fairly well, so we're going to draft more for this top jungle 2v2 scenario, which is more of our strength. But as the series goes on, it ends up being way more about how we're controlling the bottom side of the map, because SKT really wants to play for these types of dragons and these scenarios more or less. And so you have like this interesting situation where you see Clid going for bot lane prio and then moving for 4 mid, like this type of more collective team controlling through bottom river to the mid section, and then G2 then adapting in game 4 to go through mid and then collapse on bot. Like these types of weird kind of macro adaptations were way more interesting in this series than where I feel like the IG FPX series was, okay, FPX are going to go from bot to mid, and IG are just never going to adapt to it. You had like this more interesting evolution of how do we get priority in mid lane to affect bot, and then and then also do the rotation so that way we can control that. A lot of that in the 4th game ended up being kind of hijacked, or not the 4th game, but the 3rd game ended up being kind of hijacked because Wonder was bleeding out too much. So they had to transfer a lot of that pressure to control the top side and to allow him to push out. Which was fine, but that also meant like giving up a lot of bot side map advantages that they had worked for, stuff like that. But it was just very interesting to me that G2 consistently went for, I think the biggest example of this also is the very first game where they trade the Infernal Dragon for 2 topside turrets, right? Yeah. I think that
after SKT got Herald, right? Yeah.
They also traded bot inhib for Baron, I remember. But they were consistently kind of playing for these map advantages, these map control advantages over neutrals. So I thought that was a really kind of interesting thing to watch, because that was a big difference that struck out to me, is LCK teams consistently wanting to play for these neutral fights and not really knowing how to get advantages outside of that. And then it was really funny, because it's like how everyone said that the West should adapt to deal with China, but it's more, okay, now we're dealing with Korea this way. So I thought that was interesting for sure.
Yeah, I think it's funny because even when like, what did you think of Game 4 draft? Because when I was looking at this, from SKT specifically, because I was looking at this and I was like, they're basically drafting like an IG FPX composition.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, to piggyback on what you said about like how they really only know how to fight around neutral objectives. When you have a composition like this, the point is to try to create like advantageous skirmishes through lack of vision. And that is one thing that, with the way that Chris roams Tian's pathing and then just Doinby's playstyle, something that FPX do really, really well, right?
Yep.
And I think SKT did not know how to take advantage of this composition and like what it can do. Like, even putting Faker's key aside, because I think a lot of people are just going to say, like, well, Faker was obviously not comfortable on Kiana. And I would agree with that. I don't think he looked comfortable on the champion. I don't think he used that champion to the best of, like, not the best of his ability, but, like, the best of what she can do in this composition, which is setting up skirmishes and fights in choke points in the jungle, taking advantage of, again, like, lack of vision. And this was the composition when SKT drafted it. I was like, ooh, like, I don't trust them to be able to execute this. And I think that we saw them really struggle in terms of understanding what exactly this brings to the game.
I remember, I think it was actually not this game, it was the third game where G2 are usually really good about resets for neutrals when they want to contest them. And there was one where they were walking all the way bottom as if they wanted to contest, but they were like 30 seconds behind SKT in the reset. It was actually really, really an absurd amount of time. So they walked towards it, but they just didn't face check the fog, right? And they went topside instead. And it was just this more careful understanding of what SKT were trying to play. I think it's like fair to say that SKT were trying to play like FPX here, and G2 were trying to play more like what IG's drafts were, but I think these drafts were a little bit more kind of comprehensive and holistic rather than IG's being very one-dimensional. But they were kind of playing more to that side and succeeding here, so I think it's also fair to say that, you know, there's not just one way to play that's more effective.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. I think it was a big thing of misexecution on SKT's style of comps. Yeah, the fourth game was really interesting to me for sure, because I also think like some of the old con int flanks came back.
Yeah.
This should be really good. I think Vlad is really good into their comp. Like, it's good into the lane matchup.
Yeah.
If you're Yasuo ulting into a situation where Vladimir is in the fight already, then you pretty much die in most cases. So there's a lot of good reasons for this Vladimir to exist, and we just didn't see good flanking from Khan in this game. So I think a lot of the times, higher pressure stakes, you default as a player more and more to habits, right? So a lot of stuff you're working on, if it's not habitualized yet, just falls away, and you become the same player as you kind of are at your core, if you will say. So I think that's
poor Con.
something that kind of shone through a lot in that game. You see, like, the Nautilus Kiana combo. You just want to skirmish as much as possible early. You should be able to get priority in this matchup, but again, I feel like support was really, really kind of just outplaying in a lot of scenarios where, okay, the disengage came out from Gragas earlier, or Gragas just didn't get hooked by the Nautilus, or anything along those lines. Just ended up making the situations where SKT could get these skirmishes really difficult on an execution-based level. I think there were execution-based problems across all four teams. I think G2 had, as they often do, traded off which player was inting. So it was a lot of that. But I think, again, like, both of these series had a lot of interesting support discrepancy that came through. Like, support difference and just positioning of support on the map.
Yeah. Like, effort, like, again, a lot of people are going to call him out for having a really poor Leona game in game 3, but I just think as a whole he was outmatched by Mickey in almost every scenario. So that includes like team fighting, skirmishing, roaming, timing, stuff like that.
Mhm.
The funny thing about Mata coming in is that him and Teddy have negative laning synergy, it seems. You could tell from like the first time Mata tried to engage, and Teddy was kind of like, wait, what are you doing? It kind of reminded me of when Mata first started laning with Easy.
Oh, right.
So I think that's another thing to point out, because while I actually don't think Mata was like as terrible as people say he was, I thought he was actually better than Effort in terms of his understanding of team fighting and stuff. I mean, stuff you'd expect from Mata. But you did see the fact that they have negative laning synergy, and it affected the bot lane, especially since Jankos made a point to visit bot pretty frequently.
I want to watch like so many previews in this series actually, just to kind of.
I was like paying attention to bot lane, and I was just like, oof! Like the first engage was like, oh, you guys are obviously like not on the same page, which is always like unfortunate to watch, right? Like you don't. I mean, I don't go into games wanting that to happen. I just want to see everyone playing at the best of their ability. So, that's one thing I did want to point out though, because I feel like a lot of people have been, you know, like publicly like pooping on Effort for saying he's like super terrible, pooping on Mata for coming in and also being terrible. And I don't think that's necessarily the case, but I do think Mata brings different things than Effort does, and Effort did have a very poor game 3 when it came to like skirmish, like specifically when it came to stuff that's very visually intuitive for anyone to see, like Leona, like hitting Leona skill shots, you know.
I think it was. I actually thought the substitution was good because Effort was having a really hard time in game 3. I was curious if you would have thought that bringing Leanne back in the IG series would have any merit. Because on one hand, he's really green and awkward, but on the other hand, I think that, especially in the Gauntlet, we saw him enabling a style of play that was much more kind of Rookie and the jungler being in sync. And even Baolan went out of his way a lot, like went into river, just sat and camped in like the bottom bush to wait for Leanne, and then they made plays together like this. And I thought that there was much more kind of, because they kind of had to baby him, their team play around jungle was better. So I was wondering if that would have been something that would have been interesting for them. Like I said,
super interesting actually, especially against FPX and what they were drafting to do.
I don't necessarily think it would have changed anything. I think their alteration of the draft was good, but they just had a lot of misplay towards the end. So I don't necessarily think bringing Lan in would have changed anything, because they probably would have definitely still lost early map advantages. But I just thought it was an interesting idea. So
FPX G2, woo!
FPX
the
G2.
final that everyone expected, aka one team I totally expected to be here, and one team I did not expect at all.
You know what? I've been ragging on FPX the entire tournament, but I also picked G2 to win the whole thing. So honestly, I'm keeping a good solid 50-50. That's my goal here, 50-50. I'm basically...
Hey, like I said, I'm great if you take out every Chinese team prediction.
As an analyst, I'm basically the equivalent of flipping a coin. So, you know, it just really depends on your preference. Do you prefer to watch making the rounds, or do you prefer to just toss that quarter in the air? Though I think that my reasoning has been relatively interesting and insightful. I don't know, maybe quarters provide interesting reasoning. Not the point. The point is...
they provide as interesting reasoning.
What do you think happens in this final, Emily?
I think FPX lose. Like, people are going to be like, wow, surprise, Emily is not picking FPX again.
You're just a Doinby hater.
I'm not a Joinby hater. He is about to surpass Bengi and Huhi as the player that I write the most about, I think, with like one more article or something. But I think that, again, when I'm looking at this matchup, I see a team that is a lot more flexible. I see a team that should be able to respond to what FPX like to do, because their players, like, so when we talk about G2, this is actually something I didn't see talked about as much until the series against SKT, which is kind of interesting. But when you talk about G2, you have to understand that these are all players that are at or like the top of their positions. And so it makes it infinitely more difficult for a team like FPX, in my opinion, who have a very definitive play style, but they only win through that play style. And they can be out in like on an individual level. Which I said the same thing about IG, right? And then IG ended up losing, but I don't think that analysis is incorrect either. Like, even though IG lost, I still think that IG have stronger players in most positions, and ordinarily, if they're able to respond to what FPX want to do better, that automatically gives them an advantage that FPX doesn't have. Like, basically, FPX have to draft something that works really well for them and then execute it at the highest level every single time. Whereas a team like G2 doesn't need to do that, if that makes sense. Sorry, I'm rambling around my point, but basically it's just based on raw talent and flexibility. For me, it's a lot more difficult for FPX to win this match because of those reasons, because they are more limited in what they can do. And I do think that G2 will draft well against FPX. Like, I actually really liked what they did a lot of the time against SKT, where they knew, even though SKT were picking these early game compositions, they were making sure to lock in things that still worked out well in late game team fights, because you're kind of relying on SKT to not necessarily be able to execute some of these compositions at like the highest, if you're basing it on their performance at the World Championship thus far. So that tells me that G2, study their opponents pretty well. So I think they'll be prepared for FPX and draft. I don't think it's going to be a 3-0. I think FPX probably will take one game. But I just think that they are outmatched by G2. I think Mickey should be able to go toe-to-toe with Crisp. It's just like it's a hard ask, because I think a lot of Crisp. Like, this is not a slight to Mickey, but I think really highly of Crisp. I think Mickey should be able to match him fairly well, and that's going to affect what FPX wants to do.
Yeah, like when we talk about IG, we talk about support jungle discrepancy between IG and FPX, which is pretty evident. It just comes down to the side of, I think, at a certain point, your laners have to be competent enough before jungle support can matter. So your laners have to be competent enough where jungle support can even matter. But at a certain point, if your laners are competent enough, then jungle support just makes a difference of every game. So I think that if you're looking at this, the false assumption that you make in the IGFPX series is kind of like their laners are obviously competent enough to execute on what they want to do, right? Which might be a very narrow thing, but which my assumption was kind of like, okay, FPX laners are not that competent, so the jungle support difference is not going to matter. But if the laners end up being competent enough, then Tien wins, right? So Tien Crisp win. So I think that that's something to look at, is that you're not having this really interesting dichotomy of complete and utter jungle support discrepancy. I think Jankos hasn't had the best tournament. He ended up getting MVP for that series, but I don't agree. I think it should have been Mickey X for sure.
I was gonna say, give it to Mickey.
But I think that he hasn't had the greatest tournament, and neither has Wonder. I don't necessarily think that they're equipped to target G2 on the same wavelength that SKT are. And bot lane it will probably come down to G2 either trying to match what FPX want to do, which I think is difficult just because, yeah, you can counter Nautilus, yeah, you can counter Kiana, but you're countering them as a 2v2 is difficult. Like, they're going to out-skirmish you. So it will come down to, if G2 decide to match that kind of thing, it'll come down to draft, but I think, as evidenced by this series, it's going to be pretty evident that G2 don't really want to do that. I can even see them doing something like picking Vlad mid, just to kind of avoid this type of engage or this type of scenario. I can also see them taking stuff to the bot lane, right? So getting mid jungle and then roaming bottom instead of having their bottom lane roam to mid, which is more what FPX want to do. So they initially get have Cavs get the pry on the first wave, roam bottom, look for dives there instead of just. And then you're taking also the skirmish to the river, potentially. It's a lot less inside FPX's comfort zone. Playing for the wave is much more what they like to do with their skirmishes. So I think it's it'll really depend a lot on how they're like those first 3 minutes are kind of like the FPX minutes, right? We have Splice o'clock, which are 35 minutes.
35 minutes.
And then we have FPX o'clock, which is basically the
3 minutes.
So I think planning out how to address those 3 minutes are going to be pretty crucial. So you can either draft to completely avoid the 3v3 and then outscale, which I think is a pretty good approach. So even going something like Vlad mid, which will have no prio whatsoever, if you think that you can kind of outplay their jungle, hold down the fort from that aspect, or you just draft for really, really heavy mid prio and basically doing B to the punch. I think either of those approaches are better. I kind of like the second one more. But yeah, it'll really just depend to see how they want to play it out. But I think that G2 have a lot more options, as you mentioned. They have a lot more options than IG did. They have a lot more options than Fnatic did, because I think that most of their laners are better than Fnatic's laners. There's a reason why G2 is the only team where I had a player in every single role in my top 3. I think that they're basically the exception that proves that super teams don't exist rule, in the sense that, yeah, they're actually probably the most successful or the only successful super team in history. Like, it could have easily have been SKT, right? But they couldn't make the Mata situation work. They couldn't make, like, the Con Peanut situation work, right? Any of these sort of attempts at super team iterations, SKT have had to default more on their model of raising talent to fit the mold that they already have. Whereas I feel like G2 had this idea of something that's very flexible, and so they just ended up having players with a lot of flexibility, a lot of willingness to try things, and that's really interesting to see. I said going into the tournament they'd win. I still think they're going to win. I've screwed up my predictions on who's going to be the tournament winner so many times, Emily, but you know what? It's time for the redemption arc. Let's go.
Yeah, we both picked Fnatic last year, right?
Pre-tournament, I definitely didn't pick Fnatic. I forget.
No, I didn't. I'm just thinking of the show that we did like right before finals. Yeah. I think we both picked Fnatic.
Yeah, we both picked Fnatic, but pre-tournament, I picked either RNG, Samsung, or Africa, one of those. I can't remember which one.
I picked RNG.
Yeah. So, anyway. Anything else?
Yeah. No, I mean, I honestly, actually, one thing I do want to say is that if you're looking at, typically Worlds, in my opinion, doesn't showcase like the year as a whole. Like, typically there's a tournament meta change, and whoever ends up winning, like IG, for example, last year, is the team that meta suits the most. But it's not necessarily reflective of the year as a whole in League of Legends, which I still think would have been exemplified by a team like RNG. This year, I actually think we have the rare case of two teams that really exemplify what League of like oddly enough, exemplify what League of Legends was as a whole, and in terms of how they ended up playing for most of the year. You know, like these are not teams that adjust. Like, sure, they adjust from game to game and from series to series, but they stuck to their core identity, and they're both in the finals, and no tournament meta shifts or anything like that changed. So I think that's actually pretty interesting to see from Worlds Final, because I feel like we don't always get that.
Yeah, I think it's just for sure kind of good fundamentals in terms of what they want to execute is something that kind of differentiates these teams. So I also think that if you have a really good support player, then right now support is a broken role. It just honestly
you should just go back and like spam retweet that article you wrote that everyone got mad at you for.
I'm actually kind of upset that I picked Ming, I think number 1, Mickey X. And then I was like, do I put Crisp or Hylissang third? Because I thought that my big deciding factor was Hylissang basically carries this team. Like, let's be honest, Fnatic needs to be hard carried by their support. And so, whereas I felt like Tian is a much more competent jungle, and it's much more of a partnership between Tian and Crisp, Hylissang really ran it down, but Crisp was my clear number 4. So I think the fact that the final showcases the top 2 of the what I assess as the top 4 supports in the tournament is it's pretty self-evident that role is really important. So I think that's an exciting one for sure. Like I will be very surprised if this is a series where either Crisp or Mickey X don't show MVP performances. I don't expect them to be chosen as MVP by the analyst desk because they're gonna pick
their supports.
They're gonna pick Perks or Doinby most likely, but I think that it'll be a pretty clear showcase of whoever it'll come down to better support wins, I think. So we'll see. Also, one shout out. I think that this series is really important. The fact that people don't understand, or the fact that G2 have done really well, is something that shouldn't be understated. Because I remember very clearly when I started in League of Legends, and prominent figures who will rename nameless, who were commentators who did shows like this, were saying that, you know, if you're a European team or a European player, you should just consider Worlds a vacation, like a free vacation. Just go chill, hang out.
Wait, people actually said that?
Yeah, this was years ago, remember? And not even try to try, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, years and years ago.
I thought you were saying people said this year.
No, of course not, But I think this is definitely showcased that there are 3 competitive regions, right? You don't have to play Korean solo queue to be one of the best players in the world. And that's something that I think every region should definitely take to heart and realize that they can improve. When you say the gap is closing, it's not like the gap is constantly jumping. You can close it. So I think that's something that's really interesting and exciting and inspiring about this series. And a lot of people
about Worlds in general now. Like, Worlds in general is really not... Like, I know the takeaway from this is going to be people saying whatever region that wins is default the strongest region. I still think G2 is the strongest team for this year, just like I thought RNG was the strongest team for last year, even if they end up losing. I don't expect them to, but I'm just throwing that out there, and just in case, still think G2 is the best team of 2019. But the cool thing about Worlds for the past 2 years is that it has been about who is the best team at this tournament, regardless of region. And I really like that because it opens up so much more for analysis when you're looking at these different teams and how they play. And I think the way that FPX and the way that G2 play, as much as I have harped on the fact that FPX are really predictable in the way that they want to play, I think the style in which they play is very cool. And no other team plays that way, right? And it makes them super interesting to watch. It makes them a fun team to watch. And G2, like, I think a lot of teams went into this year because G2 is the default, like, best team of 2019. And they looked at what G2 wanted to do, and they're like, we can do that too. And you can't, because G2's players, like you said, are just, like tops in their position. And that allows them to be remarkably flexible. And it makes them, again, like, insanely fun to watch. So I think that's another really cool thing about Worlds this year and also Worlds last year, right? Where we were comparing how different teams matched up. It's so much more fun for analytically.
Yep, I think for sure that's a really fun thing. I also just think that, people say that G2 is the exception, but there used to not be exceptions, right? So it's definitely a step forward.
Cries in KT.
I mean, my goodness, OMG.
Oh god.
I don't even want to talk about it. It's like,
it makes me sad.
I don't even want to talk about 2014, 2015 OMG anymore, ever again. Every time people bring up that team, it's just so sad. Anyway, but the thing, but I think that there's a lot of really cool stuff to take from G2, in general, and I kind of want to play at the end of this video the clip from the score interview where Perks made the comment that he thinks EU mids can be just as good as Asian ones, right? And you remember that from 2016? It was 2016 MSI.
Oh, yeah, that was when G2 mental boomed, and it was really.
But it was such an innocent comment, and this video came out even before he played in MSI, right? And everyone was flaming him in comments already. And I was just like, really? This is not even a controversial statement. So kind of shout out for that one. I think at that point, though, he was also really kind of a polarizing figure because he tried to come in with like the big trash talk and all this shit. So maybe people just automatically took offense at everything he was saying. But I think about that comment a lot because I remember thinking like, this kid is really good. He could be really good. And I did a lot of content about Perks and a lot of interviews with Perks when the last couple of years I was a journalist. So I'm really excited to see him do well. Anyway, thanks for watching Making the Rounds. We'll probably do one more after Worlds to talk about why we're wrong as usual.
We really need to change the show to why we're wrong. We considered it last year.
I'm really feeling the Two Girls One Show. I think this is the branding direction we need.
Wait, yeah, why can we not do that? Oh, because of Yahoo. Okay.
Yeah. We should change the branding. I should get a new overlay and then we'll have new branding for next season. There we go. All right. See you guys next time.